On Saturday, at my direction, the United States successfully concluded an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan, that killed the emir of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
After a 21-year manhunt, the breakthrough came in Kabul. U.S. intelligence agencies had tracked Zawahiri to a safe house downtown in the upscale suburb of Sherpur. For months, they built what they call a pattern of life, trying to determine if the man frequently seen sitting on the balcony was really him. At 6:18 a.m. Sunday morning Kabul time, he ventured onto the terrace, and a CIA drone fired 2 Hellfire missiles at the building. The Americans say no civilians, including family members, were killed in the strike, which used blades, not warheads, to slice rather than blow up the target. This morning, the area was quiet. Al-Zawahiri had reportedly moved here from Pakistan to be with his family, courtesy of the Taliban government. The house apparently belongs to Afghanistan's Interior Minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who has a US government $10 million bounty on his head for terrorism. The Haqqani network is a powerful faction within the Taliban government. They've long had close relations with al-Qaeda and have continued to harbour members of the group, despite an agreement with the Americans not to allow Afghanistan to be used for planning attacks on the US and its allies. The Taliban issued a statement saying that it strongly condemns this attack and calls it a clear violation of international principles. Al-Zawahiri was Osama Bin Laden's number 2, frequently described as the brains behind al-Qaeda. After training as a doctor in his native Egypt, he didn't save lives, but destroyed them. The 2 men fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and then founded al-Qaeda together. He was key in the planning of al-Qaeda's signature terror attacks. The blowing up of the US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 1998. The bombing of the USS Cole off Yemen in 2000. And most notoriously, 9/11, the multiple attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon, in which 2,977 people were killed.
No matter how long it takes, no matter where you hide, if you are a threat to our people, the United States will find you and take you out.
Back in 1982, Al-Zawahiri was tried and imprisoned in Egypt after participating in the assassination of the secular president Anwar Sadat.
We are not sorry about we have offered for our religion, and we have sacrificed, and we are still ready for more sacrifices till the victory of Islam.
After Osama Bin Laden was killed in a US strike in Pakistan in 2011, Al-Zawahiri became the leader of al-Qaeda. In recent years, he's appeared several times on camera, exhorting jihadists to keep fighting. But he became less relevant as a new generation of jihadi leaders emerged. They had better video skills and even more extremist views, splitting off to form the Islamic State, first in Iraq and Syria, and then across the world. Al-Shabaab in Somalia have remained part of the al-Qaeda franchise, as have similar groups in Yemen and the Sahel. But it's not clear how closely their leaders listened to the instructions of al-Zawahiri. Arguably, he was already effectively, if not physically, dead, and his as yet unnamed successor may have even less influence. After US troops left Afghanistan almost a year ago, counter-terrorism experts feared they'd no longer be able to target al-Qaeda or ISIS leaders in the country. But this strike shows that they can from bases in the Gulf. But who were their eyes and ears on the ground? The Taliban have pretty much full control of Kabul. Arguments about who gave away al-Zawahiri's location have already started, as well as a dispute about whether he should get the equivalent of a state funeral.
Lindsay Hilson there. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Mary Beth Long in Washington, D.C. She served as Assistant Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. But first, let's hear from Colin Clark, a counterterrorism expert and Director of Research at security consulting firm, the Sufan Group. Colin Clark, thanks for joining us. Ayman al-Zawahiri didn't have the profile of Osama Bin Laden and what some might describe as the charisma. How significant was he?
Well, you're absolutely right. He didn't have the charisma. He was often criticized for being very pedantic, very boring in his speeches. But behind the scenes, he was critical to the strategy of al-Qaeda. You have to remember that Zawahiri took over from bin Laden right around the beginning of the Arab Spring and helped al-Qaeda weather that storm, as well as the rise of the Islamic State starting in 2014. So two pretty significant events that Zawahiri is able to kind of navigate and keep al-Qaeda as a cohesive entity.
And is this the end for al-Qaeda then, having lost their number two and now their leader? Previously, they lost followers to ISIS also.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, there's been, plenty of times where we've prematurely written the obituary of a group like this. These groups are highly resilient. They're highly adaptive. And again, if you look at where Zawahiri was killed, he was in Kabul. He was there at the invitation, presumably, of the Taliban and the Haqqani network, which means they're essentially operating a state that could once again become a safe haven or sanctuary for transnational terrorist groups. We're going back to the situation pre-9/11, which is foreboding in many ways.
What do you know about how he was actually tracked down?
Yeah, so it seems like his whereabouts were known since about April. And similar to the way bin Laden was tracked, it was his network, the network of individuals who, either brought him things, his couriers, or in this case, it seems to be that his family was tracked because they were there living with him. So the fact that he was so brazen and cavalier to go to the capital of Afghanistan in Kabul tells you how comfortable he felt and how safe he felt, although that ultimately worked against him.
But given that until not very long ago, the US had boots on the ground in Afghanistan, how did he evade capture for so long?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, I think a lot of that information is going to come out in the coming weeks and months as we learn more about where he spent time, in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. It was largely believed that he was in Afghanistan for years, likely along the Afpak border and around some of the kind of tribal areas that al-Qaeda long called home.
Is there an immediate successor to him?
Well, that's a great question. That's on the minds of counterterrorism analysts and intelligence agencies everywhere. I'd say Saif al-Adil, also an Egyptian, also a veteran jihadist with longstanding credentials, is often thought to be the leading choice. But there's complications there because al-Adil is believed to be hiding in Iran, which is, brings a whole other set of complications, including the fact that he could be under the thumb of the Iranian regime, or like his now deceased longtime partner, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, he could be killed by what were allegedly Israeli commandos who took out al-Masri several years ago in Tehran.
And how should we view this drone strike? Is it a sign that the US is restarting a military war on Afghanistan, having withdrawn troops, or actually is it a completion of the war on terror?
I'd say it's neither, but if it's one or the other, it's probably the latter, a completion. A lot of people are talking about this as the logical bookend to the global war on terrorism. There's a lot of counterterrorism fatigue in the United States. There's a great desire to move on from the so-called global war on terrorism to engage in great power competition. But we can't forget that our enemies get a vote too. And so certainly this won't be the end of jihadist terrorism emanating from Afghanistan and from the broader region. The United States is going to have to keep an eye on this as it deals with simultaneous crises in places like Ukraine, and now potentially as we're seeing in the South China Sea.
OK, Colin Clark, thank you very much. Let's turn now to Mary Beth Long. Mary Beth Long, what do you make of the timing of this drone strike? Why now?
I think it's probably a factor of two things. Number one, opportunity. Obviously, they've been looking at him since April. It looked like he had increasingly gone out on the balcony, and they were able to identify that he was in the home after tracking the movements of his family. So opportunity. Second, I think it's been increasingly clear there's been increasing domestic criticism of the Biden administration that the Taliban are working not only with the Haqqani network and with the Taliban, but that they're using Afghanistan as a launching pad against the agreement for attacks, particularly in Pakistan, where attacks from the Pakistan Taliban have substantially increased in the last year.
And this is going to give President Biden a political boost. How much of a political boost do you think?
I don't think it will be much. He'll certainly get a political boost for having taken the initiative and made the tough decision to do this over the horizon hit. But it does beg the question of the underlying problem, which is, I think it's undeniable now that it's very clear that the Taliban are and have been working with al-Qaeda, and that the differentiation that we tended to make between and among the Haqqani network, the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and perhaps even ISIS are false, and that at least for today, in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, there's been cooperation among all, if not or most of those players.
Was a drone strike the right move? It is effectively an extrajudicial killing. Should he not have been captured and put on trial?
Well, whether it's the right move, it's probably the only move we have to make. With the decision of having left, it's very clear to everyone we have few assets on the ground, and that something over the horizon was really the only option. However, the U.S. has long held that with confirmed terrorists, terrorists who appear on our watch list, and internationally known people and organizations that are terrorism, that we can and have been taking them out with drone strikes, increasingly actually even since the Obama administration.
Now, the Taliban see this as a violation of the agreement made in Doha with the US. Do you think it will have implications for how the US deals with the Taliban in future? Obviously, economic sanctions are still in place.
I think it will. I think it'll have implication how both parties deal with one another. Clearly, the US has sent not just a signal to the Taliban that we know you're cooperating, and how do you explain the fact that this gentleman was operating openly in your capital city? On the other hand, the Taliban now have an excuse, not only for the activities that we have been calling for a while now as violations, but to even more aggressively pursue attacks from Afghanistan, and even perhaps attacks against US interests or those of the Europeans or other Western communities within and around Afghanistan.
I want to turn to the controversy around Nancy Pelosi's visit. Why has she done it when the White House clearly, privately discouraged her?
I think Speaker Pelosi is in a difficult position. She's looking at elections next year where the Democrats are not polling well. There are a lot of domestic conversations about her leadership and other leadership, frankly, in both parties, being too old, being too set in their ways. It's been a while since she has done something that has been internationally bold, and she took the opportunity to make this trip quite bold, and as you point out, something the rest of the Democrats and certainly the Republicans have and will criticize.
I mean, the reaction from China has been fury. They're talking about the US showing unscrupulous behavior. What does this mean for US-China relations going forward?
It's going to be even rockier than anticipated. Of course, the US has taken the position that we have had speakers visit Taiwan before. None of the agreements restrict in any way any of our leadership going to Taiwan. The Biden administration has come out, rightfully so, saying this is not a commentary on the independence of Taiwan. We're still with our one China policy, but this is more of a salute to the democratic processes. And in fact, the President Tsai and what she has done, that is going to make a difference to China, frankly. And we're going to have some saber rattling, I anticipate, I think we all do, in the next week or so, and probably some fits and starts with some difficulties increasingly with the US and China, although not restricted to Taiwan, I think.
So you have these difficulties with China, you've got the ongoing difficulties in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and then you have US involvement in Ukraine. Is the US just overstretched?
Well, that's not even to mention our southwest border and our difficulties with Russia. I think most people in the US think that this is probably, if not the most, certainly one of the most dangerous times for us, certainly post Cold War or more War II. I think as our domestic politics make us look more unstable, more involved with internal domestic politics, it's going to be increasingly difficult. I don't see any one of those and others, those problems being resolved soon.